Welcome to the very first lesson of Learn Swift with Bob. So when I started learning Swift, I took courses from Lynda, Treehouse, Udemy, you name it. I've been all there. All I wanted to just was become a better developer, so I just read everything that was possible within my budget. Yeah, there was a little problem though. Most instructor, they use a lot of optional, those question mark and those bangs out there, but they don't really tell us why we use optional in the first place, right? Not how. You may already know how to use optional, how you may already know how to unwrap it, but they didn't really tell us why we use optional. Why did Swift engineers implement an optional feature that is so unique compared to other programming languages out there, right? C++, Java, they don't have optional. They just have a nil or nil. But what makes it different? Why did they implement optional in Swift? Well, we're going to question those fundamental questions in this chapter, in this lesson. On top of that, I'm going to present two rules that you must adopt when you're working with Swift. And throughout the entire course, you will hear this saying. Remember chapter 1, lesson 1? Hey, remember chapter 1, lesson 1? And let's find out what those rules are. Let's begin. Welcome to the very first lesson of Learn Swift with Bob. Today, we're going to talk about optionals, alright? Some of you guys may already know how to use optional, but in this lesson, we're going to talk about why. Why did Apple engineers or Swift engineers implement this amazing feature that differentiate from many other programming languages, such as JavaScript and C, okay? So before we talk about the optionals, why optional came out to be, I think it's important for us to go over the rules that differentiate Swift. So every variable type, the first rule states every variable type must be defined. The type, like string, int, must be defined. So for example, we have a constant name or a variable name, doesn't matter. Name is string is Bob. You've explicitly said, hey, this must be string, and you have a Bob, and there we go. And also you can let Swift implicitly state the type of new name based on what you enter right here. Bob the developer is the obviously string. Now option click on this, you have a string right there. And every variable type must be defined. It has to be defined. So my age is defined. Every other variable is defined on the bottom here. And the second rule says the type can be inferred based on the value. What you already did here, the type of new name is now being inferred based on what you enter right here, which is Bob the developer is in string. Okay, oh good. And lastly, every normal type should have value associated. So what does that mean? Normal type like string, int, double. They have value associated. Now we have Bob here, Bob the developer. So if you were to just make a variable called my name and no value associated, and you try to print this thing, it's not gonna work because you have to. In Swift, every value has to be. You have to value for every variable constant. Okay, but you might wonder, all right, these are the rules, but what are the rationales behind this implementation? Right, there must be the why. Right, it's not enough to just say these things exist. Right, sometimes it's important for developers to understand why these things are important and why did Apple engineers make this rule. Well, it's important for us to take a look at this diagram I made for you guys. This is a lecture note, by the way. Let's go. Oops. Optionals. Resources. So if you think about programming is nothing more than running a bunch of functions. So when you press that, when you press the app icon for the first time on your app, that it runs a function, and that function returns a value, and then runs the other function. That it's like a sequence of functions that executed in sequence. And in functions, when function 1 starts, you expect to return, for example, I'm talking in a very high level abstract manner, but I hope that makes sense to you slowly. So when function 1 returns, expect function 1 to return int, and function 2 takes that int value and then go through that magic and have a string. And the function 3 takes that string, so on and so forth. So it's like a loop, right? They have the product that comes out from function 1 and passes on. It's like a factory, right? There's line 1, line 2, line 3, making an iPhone. You definitely want to have some sort of a product that comes out from each line, okay? But in Swift, here's the problem. What if function 1 is expected to return int, and then function 2 is expected to take that int from function 1, but what if function 1 returns int value. What if function 1 returns no value, or also known as nil? All right, they're the same thing. No value or nil. say no value, then function 2 be like, what do I do with this? And and function 2 tries to work with something that has no value, and then eventually, I don't know, it may return string or not, and then function takes that weird value, or eventually just might crash because the function 2 is trying to work with something that doesn't exist. So a program will crash and the bad stuff happens. So Swift engineers have said, all right, let's prevent that from happening. I don't care if function 1 produces a very ugly product, it doesn't matter. As long as there's a number, and then function 2 is able to work with that number and then provide some sort of value, so at least they go through the entire manufacturer line instead of breaking it right in the middle. So that's why you don't want to have this thing right there. So that's why Swift engineers have said, all right, why not make our lives easier? Why not making every single variable, making every single constant have value associated, also type associated, so that you exactly know that this thing will eventually go through. Okay? It doesn't matter how ugly the product looks like, as long it's better than just breaking right in the middle, because function 2 cannot work with something have no value. Okay, so that's why Swift said, all right, let's make this thing default have value by default. So that's why this rules came out to be. So that's why Swift is also considered as a type-safe language. Every variable, every constant has a type associated, and also as well as value associated. All right, so that's why Swift is actually a very safe language considered because there's not many problems you could have. We live in an ideal world, but again, we don't live in an ideal world, but there are times you have to have a no value. Sometimes you have to have a nil value. One example is playing with social media app. So let's say you're making a social media app, and your app has to fetch profile picture from Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn. Okay, but sometimes the user may have a photo associated, but sometimes the user may not have a photo associated. Okay, if the user has photo, right, you have a URL for the server, you can take away from the database, right? That's good. But sometimes you have no value, right? Sometimes you have nothing. But how do you go about this, right? Well, this commonly happens, right? So this is not just a non-practical example. It just happens. So now here comes optionals, okay? And by default, by normal type, you're not allowed to work with no value, right? Because you don't want this thing from happening. That's why you have value associated. But sometimes you need to store or some sort of have nil value for a variable constant. That's why we introduce optional. Optional is actually a byproduct of these rules, okay? So I hope you guys understand that, where I'm coming from. So the only to differentiate from the normal type, the optional type, the only thing you have to do is put a question mark right there. And I'm just gonna give you a little examples. And here comes optionals. So now optional types allow storing nil. Nil means no value, right? That's a technical term in what Swift likes to use. Just say nil means no value. Okay, so now my name, put a question mark right there, and is nil. So, and if you attempt to call my name, and it's gonna return it's gonna say nil right there. And if you try to print your name, okay, it's an optional type of string, and it's gonna say optional, and on the bottom here, optional Bob Lee. Okay, so this is not a normal type. You just click on it, option click on it, you'll see that this is actually string normal type. Okay, sounds good. Okay, this is not the most important part. The most important part is why the Swift engineers have introduced optionals and why they implemented these rules in the first place. All right, if you understand these rules, then the rationale behind optional should come out, should make sense to you. Okay, all right. And the things I'm going to talk about after is not as important as to understanding why things exist. Okay, and in this course, we're going to talk about the why a lot. Okay, I like to go deep. Anyway, so I've introduced the optionals. So now, not only you can store nil my name's string, a normal optional type. You can also have optional type of int. So Bob age is nil, right? There's no value. Rob age is 1 to 3, doesn't matter, just random examples, right? So it's not only tied to string, it can be an int, whatever. But now if you try to do something like this, do you think it's gonna work? So you probably expected like 1 to 6 might come out with, but here's the thing. There are a couple rules that you have to understand this, that in optional rule that you have to understand is optional do not interact with each other. Optional types do not interact with each other. And also you must convert optionals to normal types, and the process is called unwrapping. So if you want to work with this kind of numbers, you have to convert into a normal type. And I'm going to introduce to that later. Okay, so wrap ages right now, as you can see, the int question mark, so it's optional int type, and also dan age is optional int type. So you're not allowed to work together. And of course, if you want to change the value of wrap age, feel free to. You can change it anytime you want, as long as you make it as var. Okay, cool. Yeah, it should work, right? It says yeah, change it. All right, good. And wrap age still maintains as an optional int. Okay, sounds good. But so now you want to work with optional, but again, you're not allowed to interact with each other, so you have to convert it. And there are two ways to convert optional type to normal type. Okay, and the first one is called forced unwrapping. And I'm gonna do a lot of copy and pasting for such as text, so that I don't waste your time. So one way to force unwrap or convert is simply putting a exclamation mark right at the end. So when you say Bob age exclamation mark, what happens is you are converting wrap age is right now is optional type, right? Optional int type. And if you want to convert it, all you have to do is put a exclamation mark right there, and you get this normal type. Okay. So now if you try to print new wrap age, definitely it's just gonna give you normal. There's no optional stuff. Just gonna be printing normal. The age of 3, right? Rob is 3. Okay. Same thing goes to new dan age. Nice and simple. Okay. Nice and simple. All right. That's force unwrapping. All right. It's kind of exclamation mark right there. Force. Right. And but here's a problem. So let's say we have an image from Facebook, and the user does not have the URL for the profile picture. Okay. So you have to kind of get nil value from the database. Okay. But now what happens is you try to do something like this. Let normal image equals image exclamation mark. And what's happening here? Well, what is happening? It says unexpected found nil while unwrapping an optional value. Well, this is an example. When I first started learning iOS development, I've seen a lot of examples like this, but from now on, you don't have to worry about it. So here's a problem. Now, image contains nil, and you're not allowed to. When you do this, what happens is you're converting image to normal type. And as you know, you're not allowed to have nil for normal type, and you always have to have value associated for normal type. It doesn't matter whether you store it into a constant or not. You cannot convert nil to normal type. And if you have value like Bob the developer, just random value, Bob the developer, yes, you may convert this into normal type. Okay, you may, but if it's nil, it's not gonna work. Oh, sorry, not. If it's nil, you're not allowed to do that. Okay, so forced unwrapping is dangerous, because if the optional type contains a nil value, you're not allowed to force unwrap. You're gonna get that, what we call that, unexpected error when unwrapping error, right? Unwrapping, unwrapping optional. So you don't want to do this kind of forced unwrapping. There's another way called, we call it implicit unwrapping, or we call it safe unwrapping. Okay, let me introduce to the safe unwrapping. Now this is the second way of unwrapping. Right there. So don't forget about conditional statement. I'm going to come back to you. So we have, let's say, image from Facebook. We have a string name. Let's call it Bob Face. All right, you're going to have like HTTPS, Facebook.com API, whatever. But for the sake of this example, I'm going to use Bob's face. Okay, and then of course you can simply call image from Facebook and then just do something like that. It's easy, but as you know, if Bob face is nil, you're not allowed to convert to normal type, because you're not allowed to store nil. Okay, hope that makes sense to you. But here's the thing. We can say something like conditional statement. If image from Facebook is not nil, then kind of unwrap it, okay? If it's nil, ignore it. Something like that, okay? We call this, it's very similar to the if-else statement, which you definitely need to know. You can say if. All right, let's call it, let's create a constant call, just say normal image, okay? This thing, call normal image, okay? Just constant. And then call it image from Facebook. Print. Just print normal image, okay? You can say else, print. There is no image, okay? So this is what's happening. Image from Facebook contains Bob Lee. You've said, hey, let's call this constant called normal image. And if normal image, if it's non-nil, then just print normal image, okay? And if it's nil, then just print this there's no image. There's no image, okay? We call this, it's like an implicit unwrapping. So even if it's nil, what happens is, amazingly, you don't really get this problem when you try to unwrap it. So there's no image, all right? It's safely, amazingly, just nice and simple. So when it comes to unwrapping, there are many times you have to unwrap. For example, whenever you call a database, whenever you work with database, whenever you work with API, such as getting, if you don't know what API means, it means just code written by somebody else, okay? So especially getting database with the server from Facebook, Instagram, you're using their code to get data from their database, right? So we are using their API, their own implementation of working with the server, and that's called API. Just API means code, okay? Codes written by somebody else. So when you work with somebody's API, it's definitely gonna give you an optional type, and you know how to unwrap it safely. Okay, there are many ways to unwrap. We're also gonna talk about a guard statement in later lessons, but there are two ways. Okay, one is implicit unwrapping, and also forced unwrapping. And again, you don't use forced unwrapping a lot, or probably you should ever avoid forced unwrapping unless the iOS architecture just forces you to do that. But most of the time, you can go by doing implicit unwrapping using conditional statement. We also call this binding, because what happens is when you try to get, you kind of get the value out of image from Facebook, and you kind of like, if you know the word binding means like sticking into it. So you create this normal image constant, you kind of bind, you kind of insert it, you kind of assign to normal image. We call it binding as well, okay? I think I made myself clear, and the unwrapping part is not the most important in this lesson. The most important lesson is you understand the rationales behind of these rules, why they came out to be, why it is different from many other programming languages. In fact, in JavaScript, which I often do a lot because I do web development, or C or C++, allows you to do something like this. All right, you don't have to define the type, you don't have to define the value associated, all right? But in Swift, you cannot go with that matter. You have to have value, and you have to have and also type associated. And if you're using optional type, the only thing you have to have is the type. You can always put nil, but you cannot do something like this. You cannot, because nil, you're not allowed to guess the type of something by just putting nil. You have to have type associated, okay? Always remember, type has to be available for everything in Swift. And also, if it's a good idea to understand the rules, optional do not interact with each other, you have to convert it. And they're converting from normal type to optional to normal type. It's called unwrapping. There are two ways to do it: forced unwrapping, implicit unwrapping. You kind of go with this matter. And in later chapters, later lessons, we're going to learn more effective ways to do unwrapping implicitly, okay? All right, that was the first lesson. Hope you guys learned something new. If that was too easy, that's fine. Let's see you in the next lesson. Boom. So by the way, if you hear boom, that means it's indicating that it's the end of each lesson, okay? Hopefully no one's annoyed by that. Some people, there's one person that didn't like that, but hopefully most people are fine with that, okay? In this lesson, you've learned the two fundamental concepts / rules in the Swift programming language. Rule number 1 states every single type, whether it's optional or not, the type has to be defined whether implicitly or explicitly. Secondly, There are mainly two ways to unwrap an optional type. The first one is you may force unwrap using those bang sign, or you may safely unwrap using if let. In the next lesson, you'll discover why those question mark and optional bangs automatically appear when you try to access the property and methods of an object. See you in the next lesson.